Hi, partners in learning friends. I really don't know if anyone can see me or not right now, um, because we are having some problems getting this to work for technical reasons. But look, I actually now see myself on the website and here. So I appear to be working. Yay! Okay, that's wonderful. So, I appear to be here, and let's get started. I'm sorry this took an extra 10 minutes, but I'm glad that we're all finally together. So the first thing that I want to do is this lecture has been called How to Manage Trauma During a Pandemic. And I think that one of the things I want to do before I talk about trauma in a pandemic is to actually talk about trauma in the first place. Because there are a lot of people who don't really understand what trauma is, and that's because there are so many myths and facts that surround trauma at its base level. Like, you don't really need a pandemic to experience trauma. Pandemics just make trauma that we're all already experiencing worse. And so I'm going to start by talking about what trauma is. Then I'm going to start by talking about what trauma in a pandemic specifically means. And then after I'm finished with that, I'm going to give you guys some coping skills and some things that I think can help. Because what's most important when you've been traumatized is to cultivate a nature of resiliency. And so you manage trauma. Apparently no one can hear me. Let's see. Oh, technology and Facebook is a disaster. It's just a disaster. Amy, can you hear me now? Awesome. Okay, good. So hopefully we're back and you guys can all hear me. So what I was saying before technology decided not to work, I apologize for being late. First of all, Facebook changed our online profile and I didn't really know what I was doing. So now we're good and you can hear me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to you guys first about what trauma is in the first place. And then after I finish talking about what trauma is in the first place, then I'm going to talk to you about how trauma applies to you in a pandemic. And then after we do that, I'm going to talk to you about resiliency. And so the tools that I'm going to give you about resiliency are really good for trauma, period, but they're particularly good and particularly catered to trauma in a pandemic with social distancing. So the first thing that I want to do is, if you are a parent and you're watching this, I'd like you to just grab a piece of paper and a pen, or if you don't have that, to just count on your fingers. That's fine. Because I want to walk you through an ACE score. And I do this all the time because I think that a lot of people don't know what ACEs are enough. And we need to make sure that everybody is really well versed in ACE scores. So ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And ACE scores were actually discovered in the 80s by a doctor who worked at Kaiser Permanente. And what he did was he was running an obesity study. His name was Dr. Vincent Folletti. And he was running an obesity study. And as part of the obesity study, everything was going great in that. And then all of a sudden, all of his patients would drop out. So they would lose like 100 pounds. And then they would quit and disappear and gain all the weight back. And he was very frustrating because his methods of physical help were working hands down, but then he couldn't get people to stick with it. And so he was very frustrated. So he started interviewing all of his patients who had been in the obesity study and who had dropped out. And he had a series of canned questions he was asking them to try to get to the bottom of this problem. And one of the questions that he asked was, how old were you the first time you had sex? And one of his participants said, or excuse me, he didn't ask age. He said, how much did you weigh the first time you had sex? And one of his participants said, I weighed 40 pounds. It was with my father. And he realized after that most of the people who dropped out of his obesity study were actually adult survivors of child sexual abuse. They had either been sexually assaulted by a family member or a friend. And as a result of that trauma is a deeply rooted cause of their obesity. That's not to say that every person who suffers from obesity is an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse, but that is a solid indicator. And so I like to talk to people about ACE scores. And so ACE scores are adverse childhood experiences, and they were all discovered from this obesity study. So the first thing I like to have people ponder is we're going to do the test together first. So if you would just tabulate yours as we go through. And there are 10 possible points that you can earn. So the first one is, did a parent or other adult in the house often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you would be physically hurt? If so, that is 1 point. Did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? If so, that is a point. Did an adult or a person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch your body in a sexual way, or try to have oral, anal, or vaginal sex with you? That is a point. Did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought that you were important or special? Or did your family not look out for each other, feel close to one another, or support each other? If yes, that is a point. I will also add too that questions like that, the relevant answer is the way the person feels. So if the family totally loved a child and thought that they were special and amazing, that's not the same thing as the child feeling that. So it's not just a matter of how you as a parent view the child. The matter is, what did you as a little person feel about yourself and about your family, and did you feel esteemed? Because that's really the gauge that we need to go with. It's what you felt as the individual, not what reality necessarily was. Did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to protect you? Or were your parents too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if needed? If so, that is a point. Were your parents ever separated or divorced? That is a point. I'm going to talk about that some more in a little bit. Was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes or often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or repeatedly hit over the head at least a few times, or threatened with a gun or knife? If so, that is a point. Domestic violence is something I'm going to talk about some more in a minute too. Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or an alcoholic, or who used street drugs? That is a point. Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? If yes, that is a point. And did a household member ever go to prison? If yes, that is a point. So when you add all of those up, if you have less than 3 points, you're probably okay. Most human beings encounter some form of adversity in our lifespan. It's actually rare if you get through 18 years of being alive and you don't have somewhere between a 1 and a 3 on an ACE. But if you have 4 or more, and I've encountered children locally who have as many as 8 to 10 on their ACE scores. If you have a really high ACE score, then what that means is that you're at risk. You're in an at-risk group for a lot of long-term, not only mental health consequences like anxiety and depression, but also a lot of long-term physical health consequences, such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, autoimmune. We don't even have full research right now on the connection of adverse childhood experiences with autoimmune disorders or things like fibromyalgia. So, I apologize, my office phone just rang, but my assistant is going to grab that. So if you have a score that's 4 or higher, If you've been in therapy and you've processed some of these things with a professional, that's great. But if you've never done that, or if you've done that but you're still struggling, I strongly recommend that you get in with somebody who can help you. There are ways to get relief from a really unfortunate childhood, but it does take recognition on your part that it's happening, and it does require you to work on it. So those are things that we see that lead to childhood trauma. So now I want to talk a little bit about what this actually means in terms of a pandemic. So one of the horrible but true side effects of this is that the pandemic that we're living in is not going to have immediate, the long-term effects of this are not going to be evenly distributed. And so what I mean by that is that many of our families are already struggling with low wage work, with lack of affordable housing, with lack of affordable childcare. They're already living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to pay their rent. They're already food insecure. They already don't have enough medical care. They're already being subjected to systematic racism. And when you factor all that in with social isolation and the fear that all of us have about the pandemic, what it does is it creates a toxic overload for a population who's already struggling. And honestly, this is one of the problems, and this is a political issue, but I don't want to make it one. But this is one of the problems that our nation has now, is that we really need better infrastructure so that we can address needs for people who are suffering from those things that I just described. Because when that population suffers and then we have a pandemic, they really kind of hit rock bottom. And they need a lot of extra help and support because they are in complete toxic overload. So if that's you, if you're watching this and that's you or your family or someone that you love, what I want to tell you is that shame is a worthless emotion. Shame does not help you at all. And honestly, you don't have anything to be ashamed of. It's not your fault that we're in a pandemic. It's not your fault that you potentially lost your job or your livelihood because of the pandemic. And you need to do what you need to do that's going to be good for you and your kids. So if you need to call a crisis hotline or visit a food bank or do whatever you need to do to get relief, get it. Please get it. And don't feel bad about it. Because that's why people make donations. It's because we want to help. Because we understand what toxic overload looks like. If you're a person... So also to better describe that population as well, toxic overload increases the likelihood of issues like increased in substance abuse. If you are already struggling with substance use, but now you can't go anywhere and don't have anything to do all day, you're exponentially more likely to fall off the wagon and start using or increase use that you've already got kind of questionable. Family violence increases because stress about money certainly increases the likelihood of family violence. And untreated mental health problems are just going to get worse now that you're home all the time. And so one of the things I like to tell folks is that things like that are stuff that we often ignore when we talk about the effects of lifespan long-term trauma. Is that if you grew up with a parent who was a substance abuser, or you were watching your parents beat each other up all the time, or you have an untreated mental health problem, that's going to get exponentially worse if you're in an environment like that. And what it does is it ticks up those ACE scores. And the higher your ACE score is, the higher your long-term likelihood of having problems is going to be. And so it's very important to be mindful of that and to shield our kids from that as much as we can. So on that note, I'm just going to give you some of the answers that parents ask me all the time about this, just so you know. I've had women come in and say, I don't want to get divorced because I don't want to give my children an ACE score. And what I respond to that is, well, why would you be considering a divorce? Because if you want to get divorced because your husband is beating you up, or because your husband is emotionally abusing you, or because your husband is a narcissist, getting a divorce is a very good thing. Because your child is going to increase an ACE score from that as well, and that's far worse. 60% of the population has divorce in childhood on their ACE scores. That's surmountable. But growing up with that level of domestic violence or watching your mom get beat up all the time, that's hurtful to a kid. I've encountered parents all the time in DSS court environments who will say things like, well, we weren't beating on the kids, we were just beating on each other. Well, yes, but the child was present. And North Carolina now has criminal charges that you can face for being engaged in domestic violence while your children are in the home. There's actually a new crime that just came out for that last January. So that's not good. You can be charged criminally, and you should be, because fighting in front of the kids with physical violence absolutely increases their ACE scores. This is also why if you have a pre-existing mental health problem, it's really important to get treatment for that. Next, I want to try to shift gears a little bit because I've talked about a lot of sad stuff. And so now I want to talk about some things that are going to be hopefully a little bit better. So whether you are somebody with a high ACE score or a low ACE score, or you're just stressed out about this pandemic, what I would really like for you to ponder is, who are your support systems? What is the most supportive relationship that you have? And I'm not talking about, a laundry list. Like, literally, who are the one or two people who are the most supportive people in your life? I hope it's someone you're quarantined with, but if it's not, really think about who that is. Because having a good relationship with your support system is probably the most important thing you can do to get through this pandemic. And if you can't see your support system every day, you can FaceTime them, you can call them, you can come up with something. Because that is something that we all need, especially in the face of social isolation. So really calling upon who is my supportive relationships, that's a big deal. I also want to talk a little bit about the fact that what we're going through right now is not normal. It's really not. Losing a job is stressful when we're not in a pandemic, but it's especially stressful when you're in one and you're worried about viruses and getting sick and losing someone that you love, or grandma in the nursing home. Homeschooling at the drop of a hat, especially if you have a special needs child with a 504 or IEP, that's also stressful. I mean, that's stressful when you have children who don't have any kind of concern. But when you do, that makes it exponentially worse. Homeschooling is hard. And honestly, I don't even like to call it homeschooling. I would prefer to call it crisis schooling, because I think that crisis schooling is a better definition of what it actually is. Because it really is crisis schooling. It's hard. And so things that you can do to help, other than FaceTiming with your friends, is all breathing deeply. And when I tell people that, I get a lot of eye rolling when I tell my counseling clients that. They're like, she wants me to breathe. How does breathing help? And I can tell you, I used to be that little negative Nelly too about breathing deep, because it's like, does breathing deep really help me? You want me to breathe? It's like I'm not taking your problem seriously. I can assure you that the reason therapists tell you to breathe and to breathe deeply is because there's a neurological reason for that. Because the neurology of your brain, when you breathe deeply, it actually helps you slow down a stress response. So 2 things that I advise would be, 1, putting your hands like this, like across your heart, and just taking 2 deep breaths. So okay, so hopefully you did that with me, and do you feel better? Did just that small action make you feel better? Because hopefully it did. Maybe not tremendously, maybe a little bit. Another thing that you can do to help with that is to try to listen to a meditation CD, or even just to lay down in your bed or on your floor and try to breathe, but instead of breathing up here, try to direct your breath down to your stomach. So you're really engaging your stomach and your abdomen when you're breathing, instead of just your chest. Breathing through your stomach is very, very powerful in order to calm your neuroscience and your neurology down. So breathing deep really does help. The reason that that's also really important is that when adults feel a little bit better, we're better able to connect with our kids. And you really need to be able to have good long-term well-being in your families and your kids. And that requires being able to weather a storm. So some things that you can do to help with your kids specifically. I like to talk a lot about serve and return. So serve and return is, my baby's been doing a lot of serve and return lately. So I have a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 6-year-old. Yeah, 3 boys, 2, 4, and 6. So my 2-year-old likes to do this thing now where he does this, and he knows we can see him. And then he'll look at us like this, and then he'll cover back up. And he just giggles. And like, he really wants that reaction from us. Like, he totally wants us to respond. Or he'll walk up to me and like, he knows I'm there. Like, he knows I'm pushing his stroller. He can see me do it. But he'll still want to go, Mama, Mama. And I'm responding to him going, Paul Justin, Paul Justin. And it's this back and forth thing that we do. That is serve and return. And I know that it seems like it's just this little thing, right? Like they're doing something and I'm responding back to it. But that is how children engage. That is literally what grows their brains. And that growth in their brain is how they develop resilience. And that's how they engage you, because they're not experiencing neglect when you're doing that with them. So serve and return is, an example like that is obvious in a 2-year-old. But it doesn't matter how old your child is or even how old you are. Everyone needs a certain level of serve and return. So if any of you parents watching this are single and are on the dating market, I'm going to give you an applicable serve and return example for your own life. So let's say you pick up some guy on eHarmony or some girl on eHarmony and you're texting them, right? And let's say you text them once a day and they don't respond. That hurts, right? Like, you're like, why aren't they responding to me? Am I not, whatever? And it brings up feelings. And those feelings are feelings of rejection. And you don't feel good when you feel that way. The same thing happens with kids. If a kid is really trying to get your attention and you don't respond to it, it makes them feel bad. Now, I'm not saying you have to be there 24/7. Of course not. You need a break from your kids. You need a break too. But I think it's important to acknowledge when a child is clearly doing a serve, you need to have a return. Even if the return is just to say, sweet potato, mommy's really busy on a Facebook Live video right now. Can I spend some time with you in about 15 minutes? But remember when your child is doing a serve that you need to do a return, because if you don't, it really can hurt them. And then what happens is they'll stop doing serves over time. That's what a lot of emotionally neglected children do, is they stop showing serves, and you don't want that. So if they serve, try to return as best you can. It's also really important to maintain your social connections for you as grown-ups, but it's also important for the kids too. So, it is important to respond to text messages. I know a lot of people are like, oh, I'm that friend who never responds to my text messages. But a text message is a serve. So that doesn't mean you have to respond to it, but it's important to acknowledge it and just say, hey, I can't talk right now because of whatever, but I'll get with you at some other time. Returning phone calls. Be a serve and return type of a friend, because that's just as critical for you as it is for your kids. Send emails. Heck, write an old-fashioned letter. Other things that are good, your kids need this as well. So if your kids need to have a connection with a friend, as long as you trust that friend's parents and you think that would be good for your child, let the kid call them on Zoom. Let them have some communication with their friends. Another idea that I've heard that I really like are some of these posters that people have been making. Like, you can have your child use some art time to make a poster that you're going to display in one of the windows of your home for the neighbors. Something that says, like, I miss you world, or whatever your child wants to come up with. It doesn't have to necessarily say anything. It could just be a picture. But sometimes I think that's really good for kids, and they feel like they're having a positive impact on all of this craziness that's going on. One of my 4-year-old told me the other day, Mommy, I miss the museum. I really want to go to the Shield Museum and look at the dinosaurs. And I'm like, I know you do, buddy. And you can as soon as this virus is over. So with him, I'm going to have him draw a dinosaur, and I'm going to put that dinosaur in the window of our house. Not only so he can see it, but so his other friends who like walk around our neighborhood can see it. And he'll feel like he's giving the world a dinosaur to like, even though he doesn't really have a dinosaur right now. Or he can't go to the museum now. I also think that it is absolutely critical for you as a parent to get a break from the children. Some things that work for that, you know, I know some of you are trapped inside with them constantly, but go for a walk. Maybe that means they come, maybe it means they don't. But going for a walk is critical. I think every one of us needs to be going for a walk every day, even if it's just, 10 minutes. But go for a walk every day. Do some of that deep breathing that I talked about, either the 2 breaths or really a full on, like trying to get breath moving through your stomach. I also think that sometimes, if we're in a normal world environment where we don't have a global pandemic going on, sometimes with these things, I try to tell moms and dads, like, well, you don't have to do it every day, or you can schedule it whenever. I don't agree with my own advice on that now. I think that's critical. I think that every single one of us need to be forcing ourselves to take a break and spend time giving ourselves self-care, because this is a lot. And we need to do it not only for the emotional health of the little people that we've been charged with raising, but we also need to do it because honestly, it helps your immune system. It really helps your immune system to do those things. That little bit of a walk, that little bit of exercise, that little bit of deep breathing, that's really important. On the immune system health too, same thing applies to wine and beer and alcohol. I'm going to tell all of you, I love wine. I do. I am not in recovery. I'm not an addict. But I will enjoy a glass of wine here and there. I have only been having 8 ounces a week, and I've been doing that for about a month. I didn't have any the first 2 weeks of the pandemic, and now I'm down to literally 8 ounces a week. And the reason that I think that is really important is that alcohol lowers your immune system. And a lot of people don't realize that, but it really, really does. Drinking too much, and I know you're bored and you might want to have a glass here and there because you're home and you've got nothing else better to do, or because you're really stressed out. But drinking alcohol does lower your immune system. So I would really try to lay off the booze right now, because it's not helping. It's probably just going to compound the problem. You don't need to get sick with something that's not COVID and then think that you have COVID and get incredibly paranoid. So there's that. I also think it's important right now to minimize exposure to the news. And that doesn't mean that you don't stay informed. So I think it's important for where you are locally, like if you look on your health department's daily, this is what's happening, and just read their rules. I think that's helpful with staying informed, because then you can kind of know how bad the virus is, like, or, oh, it's going down, our numbers are reducing here. You can kind of get that. But I don't think it's healthy to watch the president and the governor's press conferences all day. I don't think it's helpful to read everything under the sun about this virus and about the antibodies and about testing and what they're doing. I mean, that's helpful if you're a science geek and you're into it because you're really into the study of the science of it. But if you're just trying to get through this pandemic and parent, it is not helpful for you to just sit and read and watch the news all the time. And I also don't think it's helpful for your children. One of my sons, my 6-year-old, asked me the other day who Dr. Fauci was. And I just told him that he's a brilliant doctor who's being charged with keeping us safe and helping us fight the virus. Because I don't think he needs a bunch of political information at 6. He just needs to know something positive, that there are people who are working to help this. And that's all I told him. It's very concrete. The 5th thing I'll tell you about, like, raising kids during this is routine. And you would think that, like, well, of course we have a routine. We just stay home all day. We don't do anything. But you really still need to structure a day with your children. And that's pretty much with all children. Kids just do better when they have a routine. So I would really work on, my kids know when they do schoolwork, when they take a nap, when they eat. They really know. And when we do a family walk, and they ask to do those things now, and I really, really try not to deviate from the routine. And what I found is that some things my kids were very resistant to initially. Like, they were particularly resistant to the family walk at first. There was like, we don't want to. But now they look forward to it. In fact, that's what I'm doing as soon as this is over, because we do our family walks at 4 o'clock. And so I know they're going to like be at home ready for mommy to come home and do the family walk. And that's good. I mean, I want them to have that, and I want to be able to provide that for them. So routine is critical. And I think the last thing that I will say is, I guess a few closing comments. One is that I think it's really important to have radical acceptance of where we are right now. So radical acceptance is something that I learned when I was studying borderline personality disorder. And it's basically something that I talk to adult children who have a borderline parent about, which is that you have to accept this individual for who and what they are. You have to accept that they're going to act in conformity with their character. Same's true with narcissists. You just have to accept that that is who they are. And that stinks, and you got a raw deal, but you just have to radically accept it. And honestly, this virus is kind of the same thing as an abusive parent. There is nothing that we can do about it other than what they're telling us to do with the social distancing and the hand washing it. You can't fix this virus. You can't make it go away. You can't make a vaccine come out faster. You can't control how soon the governors or the government decides they're going to reopen. You have no control over that. So all you can do is to radically accept that this is our lives. And I get that that's hard. It was hard for me too at first. But I really focused on, I'm going to radically accept that this is where we are. And from there, I'm going to try to do what's going to be in the best interest of my kids. And if you can kind of focus on doing that, I think that you can quickly get a routine, keep the kids away from the news, engage in a lot of serve and return, call upon that support person that you have, especially if they don't live with you. Make sure that you're maintaining your personal relationships with texts and with friends. Make sure that you are giving yourself a break with a walk or some deep breathing. I think you can do those things. Another thing too, and Carla, I see your question. I'm going to read and answer that in just a second. Another thing that I think is really critical is to give all of your kids, this is especially important if you have more than one child, some special time. So what I do in my house is I literally call it special time. And all of my boys know that each of them gets special time with me every day. And it might only be for 10 minutes, depending on what day it is. But each of my children gets special time with me. And in special time, I am not paying attention to hopefully my husband's in the house and he's taking care of the little ones. But I'm not on my phone. I'm not playing a game. I'm spending time with that child. And I always ask my child, is there anything you want to talk to me about? Like, is there anything you want to ask me? And I also, if they have nothing, then I either use that time to try to read to them, which is excellent for their brain development no matter how old they are. Or I'll say, would you like to curl up and watch a TV show? And I'll watch something on PBS, but I'll do it with my child. Because what you really ultimately want is you want your kids to be comfortable talking to you, and you want them to build resilience no matter what their ACE score is. And you do that more by giving them individual time and special time. So Carla's question is, Carla, one kid age 10 is overly concerned and the teens are underwhelmed. All have ACE scores, all adopted. Any ideas? Yes. So with the 10-year-old who's really concerned, I think that is probably just deeply rooted in anxiety. And I completely understand that being deeply rooted in anxiety. So what I would recommend that you would do with that child is I would sit that child down and try to give them as much concrete speech as you can. Tell the child things like, remind them that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they don't, of course, they don't know what that means, but remind them that what they basically need is going to be met. So tell the child, you are going to have food, you are going to have water, you are going to have a safe place to live, you are going to have me. And if the child responds with something like, well, I'm scared, I don't want you to get sick. What if you get sick? Then I would respond by saying, I am following all of the rules. I am washing my hands. I am socially distancing. I am very hopeful that absolutely nothing will happen to me because I'm following the rules. And if you follow the rules, you're minimizing your risk a lot. And I would just give that child reassurance that while there may be people in the world who are going to struggle as a result of this virus, you are not going to be one of them, because I am here and I'm going to make sure that you have food, water, clothing, shelter, and me. And nothing else matters. You're going to be fine. You have to remember that kids that have been through that level of trauma, or who have been through an ACE score and have been adopted, they go back to that trauma. So, because it's fight or flight. I mean, that stuff gets into your amygdala. So it's not something that they process through their frontal cortex. It's an immediate response to fear. And so they're having that immediate response to fear where they go back to memories of not having food, water, or a supportive, loving parent who would meet their needs. So I think with that child, you just need to reassure them. And if the child goes back to, but I heard this, but I think this, but my sibling said this, go back to, that may be true, but that doesn't apply to you. Your needs are going to be met. You're going to have blah, 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 because I'm here. A score of 9, yeah, that's a lot. That is a lot of fear. The other thing, I would absolutely not let that child watch the news. I would tell that child the news is not helpful. Don't have it on around him at all. Watch that when he's not around. With the teenagers who are underwhelmed, when you say underwhelmed, Carla, are you meaning that like the teenagers are just not really having a serious response to this and that they're just kind of like whatever? I guess this would be easier if we were talking face to face. If you want to DM me or PM me any follow-up questions about the teenagers, that would be great. I think that was pretty much everything that I had for you guys. I really hope that this was helpful. If you need to have follow-up questions, I'm perfectly fine with follow-ups. You're more than welcome to send those to my Facebook Messenger. So it's Paula Yost Shoop. I use my married name on Facebook, but otherwise all my professional licenses just say Yost. The other thing you can do is, if you need, Carla, I'm going to come back to that. If you do need counseling right now, I can do that with telehealth. And I can do that on a sliding scale based on, your particular situation. So Carla, with teenagers and not wanting to socially distance, I would just be the firm hand of mama and tell them that it's not a choice, because it's not. I would tell them that, unfortunately, what that means is that you also need to set a good example by also socially distancing. So I'll tell you guys a quick story about this. I have a really good friend who has been socially distancing. Her and her family have totally been socially distancing like for a month. They've been home on lockdown, doing what they're supposed to do. They've never left the house. Like Publix is delivering their food. Like they're on it. They're following the directions. Well, she was going to lend me a book. And so I told her last weekend, well, I'll drive to your house on Saturday around 1 and I'll pick the book up from your mailbox. And she was like, oh my gosh. She was like, why don't you just stop and we'll have a glass of wine in the backyard? And I was like, oh, I've missed you, because this goes back to my social connections. This is one of my friends. She's important to me. I would love to have a glass of wine on your porch. I haven't had my 8 ounces this week. I'm totally showing up. She texts me like the next morning and she's like, I have bad news. You can't come over now. And I was like, why? And she was like, because Sean heard me talking about how you were coming over here. And his response was, well, why can't my friends come over here? And she was like, and I can't argue with that. She's like, I know you're doing what you're supposed to do, and it would have been so nice for us to even sit 6 feet away from each other and drink a glass of wine on the patio, but we just can't, because it's not setting a good example for my son, and because he's going to have a meltdown about it. And she's right. So we didn't go, and I picked up my book from the mailbox. But we'll do that after this is over. So I think with your teenagers, you just need to tell them that, you know, if they want to FaceTime friends, they want to text friends, that's fine. But they can't be hanging out with their friends. They can't exactly model the behavior. You've got to model the behavior you want them to see. And sometimes that's so hard. That's one of the hardest things about being parenting. No one said that this was easy. But yeah, you really do have to model the behavior, because you can't fail to do that and then expect that they're going to act differently. And what they'll actually do if you tell them something, and then, like, if I had gone over there and had that glass of wine and her son had observed that, what really would have happened is he would have disrespected her, because he would have been like, well, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. You're a hypocrite. You're telling me one thing and then you're hanging out with Paula. Like, that's not cool. And you know what? Who can blame him? You know, I mean, we kind of are humans, and they're smart humans. So we kind of have to respond accordingly. So anyway, I think that was all I had. And, you know, I guess good luck with everything. I hope you all survived the pandemic really well. Bye.